We're going to have a little bit of fun today as I go through and try to recreate Kate Bush's iconic lead sound from Running Up That Hill. Obviously, this song is back in the public consciousness, but this song has been a banger since it came out in the mid-'80s, and I've had a lot of time to listen to this song. My sister was a big fan. She had Hounds of Love on vinyl, so I have definitely been hearing this song and this sound for a long time, and now with its resurgence in popularity, I figure it's time to do my best to recreate that sound and talk you through all the various stages and processes that went into it, at least for me. So it's going to be impossible to nail this thing one-to-one for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about, but at least all of those various processors that could have potentially impacted that sound on the recording, we're going to try to kind of replicate and recreate as best as we can. So without further ado, let's get into it. Be sure in the comments if you have ideas on how you could actually make this better, make this closer to the original. Feel free to share those down below. All right, let's do it. Step one is to always have your reference so that you can kind of A-B and like really A-B consciously as compared to just thinking that, okay, I know this sound, I've got it in the back of my head. That can sometimes work, but it's usually nice to have this just as a backup if you need it. Second thing is the sound source. So we've actually used the CMI and we've tried to grab, that same supposed Cello 2 sample that Kate Bush used, and we haven't gone fancy with it at all. We're not really utilizing this instrument to its full potential or what makes it really kind of fun and crazy, but that's fine for the sake of like authenticity. So this is what this sample sounds like. And if you're curious to kind of know the sampling mode, when you play something lower, you get that slower sound, and when you play something higher, it goes really quick. So if you have any kind of staccato cello stab and you use like the repitch mode on your sampler, or you have some kind of like old school sampler plugin, that's what to use and that's what to do, and you should be able to get something relatively similar without too much effort or needing to have this actual instrument. From the edit page, the only thing I changed slightly was adding in this little bit of low filtering. I experimented with this and I found that I liked this the best, setting 2 on the low, but is it subtle? Yeah, it's absolutely subtle. Under functions, I've added this little tiny envelope, really fast, plucky envelope, which is routed to the fine tuning on the pitch. Okay, and that just gives it that little extra snap at the beginning in the attack phase. And that's all I've done. So I experimented, if you're curious, with adding on pitch shifter, and I played around with that, and I could never really get something that I liked. So I ultimately just went with nothing and did not use the reverb from this instrument either. So here is our famous riff. And it plays out just like you would expect it to. What I went into next was a digital to analog converter plugin. We're using the tall one here. And this is just going to kind of re-emphasize the fact that this is like this really old school, early digital hybrid type of a synthesizer. And then we're going to go through that digital to analog converter as we start to move forward with our processing and eventually have to move into our channel strip and then go through tape. So that's the reason this is on here. And it just kind of smooths out the top end a little bit and rounds out the bottom, but it's very subtle, certainly not necessary. If you don't have a plugin like this, it's not that big of a deal. I flicked through a bunch of different presets and ultimately found this was what I liked the best because it's kind of the most subtle. And off. So really just listen to the top end. Okay, that gives you an idea. The next thing that I tried and ultimately turned off, especially with all of the additional processing, was this like Neve preamp. And this was trying to kind of pay homage to the 80s and that British sort of a sound and Kate Bush, but ultimately it ended up almost warming it up a bit too much, which sounds funny, but when you listen to it here, it will sound good. So I like the way it sounds now. The issue is when I brought in everything else, it just was a little bit too much. So I ended up leaving that out. The next thing that we have, and I'm sure this probably wasn't done on this sound, but it's a good way of helping me get that stereo image started, was to use the ADT, the double tracking on the tape. And I just have it, I think, up on its default position and a tiny bit of drive. Okay. So again, I would say this is something that you don't necessarily need to use, but it ended up helping me moving forward with a lot of the other processing and just starting to get a little bit of that analog wobbly spread feel that you're going to have. And we can kind of compound that by using the Dimension D. I have it on setting 2, dynamic color smooth, and then a relatively low dry wet mix here. The Dimension D does a great job of adding that space, but we're really relying on the ADT to do a little bit more of the stereo spread. Okay, then I just noticed that it was like getting kind of peaky and out of control. So I started to think about limiting, and I added a little bit of a track limiter here, just on the warm mode. So this is now kind of our starting point for the sound source. And if we want to go and turn these on and off, we can. And at this point, it sounds nothing like the reference, and that's because we need our 2 key core elements. If you watch probably any other video of somebody doing this sound design, these are the 2 things that they're going to focus on the most, and it's the things that you should be focusing on the most to try to replicate it or get something similar. So we have our slapback delay, and I really wanted to kind of pay homage to, like, you know, the 70s, 80s and these units. And the only thing I really have that does that is the Echo Rec. Now, you could probably use Sound Toys, or you could use like the Valhalla delay, and you could easily come up with that nice kind of cool slapbacky thing. But I really liked this for a variety of reasons. Things like the condition, you don't want to use used. I learned that because it gets so pitch wobbly that then it makes the reverb sound kind of too springy. But you have control over tone, and you have all this cool stuff with stereo drifts. So after a lot of experimenting, these were the settings that I liked. And what's so fun about this delay and the tiny, tiny bit of feedback we have is that it really almost adds like a diffusion to the delay as well, which is unique to this. And that's why I liked using it and decided to stick with it. The next thing we have, and you can see that I have 3 different reverbs on here. I only used the one, but I just wanted to tell you that I tried using the SAR one, which I think is like an emulation of the Lexicon 224, which is probably what Kate Bush used. Apologies if that's not the right number. And then I tried the Valhalla Vintage because there's an 80s color mode in there, but again, I could just never get something that I was really happy with. So I ended up going with the Valhalla Room LV 426 mode, and then you can see the settings that I have. You have to be very careful with not making it too wet and not making the decay too long, because you end up swallowing the delays, and you don't want to do that. The delay is like much more of a prominent feature to this sound than the reverb. It's all of the backing elements and other things going on in this composition that make it a really kind of wet and dense track. It's not necessarily this main sound. So you can see the settings that I have, and I did kind of customize this myself. And I just wanted the reverb to really surround the core elements, the fundamental and the first few overtones. And that's why you can see I have kind of an aggressive crossover frequency here, pretty aggressive on the high cut. And then I've multiplied the amount of time on the bass, and that's going to help me darken up the sound just a little bit. So with these 2 things off, we'll get a chance to listen. And now instantly, we pretty much have the sound. But you can hear how careful you got to be with that reverb, because it wants to swallow up this particular delay. All right, the next thing that we have is our SSL channel strip. And I'm pretty sure Kate Bush had some kind of 4000E series. That is what we've utilized here. And we have the compressor on to, again, kind of try to enhance that doop right at the beginning, because I know that we're going to be taking some of that away when we go into our tape. So here are the settings that I have, utilizing the E series, a little bit of a bump right around the fundamental, a little bit of a cut at around the second overtone. This is a frequency that can get very annoying and build up very quickly. We have a little bit of a bump around 4K for clarity, and then we have a little bit of a cut, it looks like around 8K, because there's just not that brightness in the original. So with this on, let's take a listen. You can see how the compressor is working. Nothing crazy. Well, actually, based on that metering, it is pretty intense, but it sounds good. So now let's take this off. Cool. And then the next thing that we have is the glue. So again, I'm under the impression that I think she had like a modified E series where there was also then maybe some kind of G series components. So I used, you know, the G series bus here using the glue. If you have the actual like SSL bus compressor, that probably makes more sense to use here. You'll get a closer timbre and tonality, but the glue is fine. And the glue is actually like very versatile for use on pretty much like all genres of music, not just when you're going for like that specific SSLG series. So that's why it's used here, but if I had the other one, I would probably use it. And I just dialed this in based on my ear, and we're using the auto release. Okay, so we'll turn these two things off and on. Off. It's very cliche to say, but that actually does do a good job of kind of vibing things a little bit. The next thing that we're going into is the tape machine. Now, if you have like Universal Audio's A800, that's probably the tape that she actually used. So you could try to get a direct emulation of the tape machine that she had that they were recording to. In our case, I ended up using Satin. I preferred it over soft tube tape because I really couldn't figure out exactly, you know, what mode to use and all that stuff. So this was easier just because there is a preset. We're using the 15 inches and we're driving into it. Not really that hard. A couple times it kind of goes into the red, but and off. So again, it does a great job kind of like the DAC that we used at sort of smoothing things out just a little bit. And speaking of smoothing things out a little bit, we are now going into things that she obviously did not have access to, but that are kind of useful for us to try to do our best to match the reference, because obviously there's so many other things and components and circuitry, all this nuance that we can't possibly like emulate, at least not easily. So I have used Soothe to try to basically take the edge off and make this thing sound less like a cello. And that's why it's set up the way it's set up here. So by pulling back on those, you know, stick out overtones, you lose the cello feel of it a little bit more. And when you listen to her sound, like you don't really instantly think cello, or at least I don't. And then we also have an EQ that's on here, just the standard stock EQ where I'm making room for her voice and, you know, just doing a little bit of this stuff to try to, you know, I don't know, make it sound closer to the reference in essence. So that's really doing a lot of the warming. And just again, trying to put that a little bit more in the pocket because you don't hear this shimmering, glittery high end. Nowadays, if you were to process a sound like this, you wouldn't do this. Like you would definitely leave that kind of shimmering high end in there because it doesn't take away, like if I didn't have this on. Like to me, that high end doesn't hurt the sound, but it's not something that's that prevalent in the reference track. So that's why we did what we did. And anyway, now we can just go ahead and turn all of these processors off and on, and you can hear the sound that we came up with. If you have any suggestions or things that you would do differently, definitely let me know, because this is a really fun kind of exercise to do and just to see and hear the different processors or ways people go about creating this sound. So, okay, let's turn them all off once, and then we'll turn them all on. And on. So that was a lot of fun to do and hopefully sound something like the original sound. It's not, a one for one, but I think it's pretty cool. And one of the nice things with the new trailer for Stranger Things and just the show and the score in general is that they take that riff and they're using all sorts of different instruments. And I think they used the CS80 in the trailer, and they've used, very emotional piano sounds and things, which has been really, really cool. So definitely looking forward to watching the end of the series. And again, if anyone's taken a crack at doing this, just let me know your chain and how you went about it, and gives us an opportunity to all learn together. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day. Bye.